What can I do with my obsession with the things I cannot see? Is there madness in my being? Is it the wind that moves the trees? Sometimes you're further than the moon. Sometimes you're closer than my skin. And you surround me like a winter fog. You come and burn me with a kiss. And my heart burns for you. And my heart burns. Elisha was obsessed. And Elijah, his master, had only 3 trips left to make before the Lord would take him away. Gilgal, Jericho, and the Jordan all needed some final work done before he left. Elijah had anointed Elisha and had just a few ends to tie up before he knew God would call him home. Now, we don't know why he didn't want Elisha to accompany him. Perhaps he wanted to finish those last 3 visits by himself. Perhaps he needed time to think or reflect before he left the earth. Maybe he worried about his disciple Elisha and thought the trips and the whirlwind would be too much for him in those last few days. Or maybe he was just tired of always being followed around by an obsessive student. But whatever the reason, 3 times Elijah told Elisha, "No, don't come with me." And 3 times Elisha replied, "Not gonna happen. I will not leave you." It's almost humorous reading the text, for in each scenario, the same thing happens. "Don't come with me, Elisha." "Too late," Elisha replies. Elisha's obsession about staying with Elijah reminds me of the beginning of the book of Ruth, when she refuses to return home to her own country, but vows to stay with Naomi instead. It reminds me of Sandy following the little orphan Annie, or Groot's allegiance to Rocket the Raccoon, or like C-3PO to R2-D2. I don't know. In each town, while Elijah took care of business, the town prophets pulled Elisha aside. "Listen, you know God's taking him away from you, right?" They asked, bewildered, it seemed, at his persistence at staying with his master. "I know," Elisha replied. "Leave me alone." Did Elisha think that if the other prophets kept their mouths shut, it wouldn't happen? Did denial keep him from accepting the truth? Everyone knew. He had to know as well. The Lord would be taking Elijah from him. But Elijah was his master, his mentor, his friend. And I don't think Elisha wanted him to go. This week, 65 Russians died in a defensive attack by Ukraine. And while I personally find the war atrocious and a human rights violation, I can't help but grieve for the loss of life on both sides of the border. On Tuesday, Missouri carried out the first known U.S. execution of an openly transgender person. A little over a year ago, our congregation lost a beautiful soul, friend, and daughter to a rare and tragic case of cancer. I tried my best to celebrate Christmas and the New Year, knowing that in my own nuclear family of 3, we're transitioning to a new family model. And so instead of celebrating, I cried and cried. And suddenly, change is upon us. You know the symptoms well. The time has come for a move to a new location, a new job, a new school, or a nursing home, and you're not ready to go. You know the hours, minutes, days until the moving van arrives, but you're not ready to think about that yet. Or maybe a parent is sick enough for the doctors to speculate about the amount of time left, and you can't handle the thought of tackling life without your mother, the one person who has always been a constant in your life. Career changes, illness, divorce, disease, all remind us of the fragility of our friendships, of the malleability of community in our lives. life will always, never be the same. People will come and go whether or not we want them to. And sometimes, even if we see it coming, the pain seems more than we can handle. 3 times Elisha denies Elijah's request and follows him from town to town. As they near the Jordan on their 3rd trip, Elijah, reminiscent of Moses, takes his mantle and strikes the ground. The water parts and they prepare to cross to the other side. It is at this point that Elijah makes this final attempt to prepare Elisha for his departure. "What can I do for you before I go?" Elijah asks, and Elisha replies, "Let me inherit a double share of your spirit." In other words, guarantee that I'll be as good as you at what I do. Elisha is afraid. The great leader is leaving him and he lacks the confidence to finish the task. Elijah admittedly tells him that he has asked for quite a lot, but states that should Elisha actually see him being taken up into heaven, then the request will be granted. So the two continue walking and talking, and soon enough, the long-awaited event takes place. A chariot of fire and horses separates teacher and student. Now, I don't really know what a chariot of fire and horses looks like, but I imagine the whole event was rather startling and confusing for Elisha, not to mention Elijah, who was swept off his feet by a whirlwind up into the sky. The scene is rather reminiscent of The Wizard of Oz when Dorothy in her house is lifted up by the tornado. She looks out the window bewildered and sees a floating cow, the Wicked Witch of the West on her bicycle, and Elijah. Elisha knows what is happening though, and he screams out, "Father, Father!" And he watches, his eyes burning, straining to see his master go, but Elijah is gone. And Elisha moves into immediate mourning, ripping his clothes apart in anguish. Can you relate to Elisha's fear or pain? He calls out, "Father, Father," and then proceeds to state the obvious over and over. The chariots of Israel and the horsemen, the chariots of Israel and the horsemen, the chariots. Was he afraid he would be unable to complete Elijah's ministry? Was he meeting depression after losing his mentor and friend? Elisha picks up Elijah's mantle that had fallen from him and returns to Jordan. He strikes the water, and with the existential question that we all ask when faced with loss, Elisha cries out, "Where is God?" When pain enters our lives, it's natural to want to find a scapegoat to blame. So we demonize our bosses, hate our ex-husband, and blame our parents. But sometimes when the pain is so acute and our situation so disconcerting that we can pinpoint no one to vilify, we turn our anger on God. We turn God into our scapegoat. Why, God, why? Where are you now? We move from lamentation into vengeance, from questioning God to accusing God. Now, please note, I'm not saying that anger is unjustified, but when anger moves to dehumanizing another person or from wrestling with God to vilifying God, then we've created a scapegoat to ease our pain. And at some point, we need to reckon with ourselves over those coping mechanisms. I've been there before. Have you? I've stood and watched the tornado of death and depression, loss and fatigue ravage my life. And I, too, have screamed out, "Creator and warrior mother, why, God, why?" When I was in 2nd grade, my best friend moved to another city. At the end of one summer filled with hide and go seek and dress up clothes and Little House on the Prairie, she was gone. I cried and resented the parents who took away my best friend. I even resented my own parents because I was a child. who didn't know where to direct her precious young grief. In 7th grade, a large department store moved to the opposite end of the mall where my father owned a local clothing store. All the business traveled to the other new east end of the mall, and my dad lost the store. That was a loss that threatened a change in community, a change in my preteen lifestyle, and a change in my father. I cried and prayed and refused to shop at Dillard's anymore. In 2005, just 1 month after I began working at my first big girl church job, I lost my former pastor, mentor, and friend from Waco when he was electrocuted while performing a baptism on a Sunday morning during worship. I was 27, he was 33. I lost another mentor, pastor, and a really pivotal giant who opened so many doors for me in the ministry. I lost him when he was exposed in 2016 as a serial adulterer and a man of the cloth who sexually groomed parishioners and young women seeking church counseling. How could I have been so blind and deceived by his leadership and affection? There are lots of types of loss when living in community. And because I'm a curious person of faith, and especially because I'm a minister, people seek me out and ask, where is God in this super crappy, fill in your own expletive situation? Where is God? Elisha demanded. And then through his dust-clogged, tearful eyes, Elisha saw something miraculous. The waters began to part, literally. Was Elisha surprised? I don't know. Encouraged? Probably. The waters split, and like Moses and Elijah before him, Elisha walked on dry land. It was a miracle that his master had performed just days before. Lo and behold, the spirit of Elijah, or more accurately, the spirit of God, had remained with Elisha, and he was able to cross over both literally and figuratively to the other side. If you're familiar with this story in 1 Kings, you may remember that Elijah met God in quite a different way. It was not through a whirlwind or an earthquake or a burning bush that Elijah found God, but rather through silence, when earlier in the story he escaped to a cave to think. But his student, Elisha, finds God in the grandiose parting of the water that allows him to cross on dry land. Unlike Elijah, Elisha didn't need silence. His head was ringing from the sound of silence in the absence of his master and friend. Elisha needed to hear God in another way, and God provided. But God didn't change the situation. God didn't rewind and alter history. This is a very difficult sermon for me to preach. You already know I'm vindictive. To this day, I'm not a fan of the St. Joseph Mall because I'm really good at holding grudges. You already know I'm bitter. You can imagine how my ability to practice resentment has matured over the years. But the grief, oh my God. There was a whirlwind of change in Elisha's life, but God didn't change anything. After all, where would Elisha be if Elijah had stayed in his life forever? Could the fear of losing and the anger of having lost his mentor be turned to confidence or determination or compassion as God developed Elisha to be himself a great prophet? While we often do not equate pain with goodness, could not God make good result despite of and through our pain? While there's no going back, loss is not always an ending? How about not equating death with stopping? I sang last week. Regardless of lamentation or scapegoating, God never leaves us with our loss, but accompanies us through the loss. I believe that's what the Bible teaches. I believe that's my experience. But that doesn't always mean I believe that statement. Some pain we will never understand, period. But in other losses, often through hindsight, we find that God was there. Creator, companion, and counselor. Life is not okay all the time, but as Elisha found, even amidst loss, God is. I am who I am. And I think perhaps God is for us as well. God knows our needs and is more than willing to meet us where we are. Sometimes God calls to us from silence, as he did with Elijah, and sometimes through great events like water parting, as Elisha discovered. But God always chooses to meet us wherever we are in life to help us cross over to the other side. No, God will not reverse death or cure every cancer or promise happily ever after to every couple. I wish God did. But God does promise to walk alongside us through every trial we face. And God offers the Spirit to give us peace and lead us to another plane. And amidst pain and loneliness so excruciating and unexplainable, God heals our broken hearts. October was the 17th year anniversary of when my friend and pastor Kyle died. A few months ago, I was driving home early from a funeral in Wichita because my pregnant sister had been hospitalized for the 4th time. And I called an old friend, and as I began to explain what was happening through the tears, I finally stopped explaining and wheezed, "And it's October!" And she understood what that meant. It's been like 30 years since my dad lost the store. In December, when we journeyed to the mall for my child's first piano recital, I asked my dad afterwards if he was okay. "I feel weird, I don't like it," was his response. And we all have our own 30 years, 17 years, 3 years ago that hang around our hearts. The author of the hymn, "It Is Well," lost all his children in a terrible shipwreck. Only his wife survived. And though many Christians lightly sing this tune, it is truly a hymn birthed out of great anguish. Knowing the author's story gives new depth to the line, "When sorrow like sea billows roll." But the author discovered that even in life's most inexplicable pain, God is there and makes it possible for wellness to exist within our broken souls. But God is not absent or blind. As Elisha discovered, God is present, pouring out grace and sending the great comforter into our lives. Truly, this means we have a good God on our side, a God engaged and willing to help us cross over to the other side of the pain, the other side of the uncertainty, the other side of loss. We must channel our obsession, our fear, our excitement into picking up our lives, planting our feet on solid ground, and walking past the whirlwinds of change to discover that God will speak to us in a new way as we continue on this adventurous journey. What can I do with my obsession? With the things I cannot see? Is there madness in my being? Is it the wind that moves the trees? 'Cause I feel lonely without hope, and I feel desperate without vision. You wrap around me like a winter coat. You come and free me like a bird, and my heart heart burns for you, and my heart